Have you ever found yourself thinking, why do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah, it's a question that, has bothered people forever, really.
It's this paradox of suffering, right? If there's goodness in the world, why is there so much pain? And that's what we're going to unpack today in this deep dive.
I mean, it really gets to you, doesn't it? When you see someone who, by all accounts, seems like they deserve good things and they just get hit with, one bad thing after another.
Exactly. And you start to question, well, what even is goodness anyway? Is it like a set of rules that everyone agrees on, or is it more complicated than that?
Way more complicated.
Yep.
The sources we've got for this deep dive, they really point out how different cultures and different times, they all have different ideas about what good even means.
Right. So what might be considered a virtue in one place could be totally frowned upon somewhere else.
Exactly.
Okay, so goodness is kind of a slippery concept.
It is.
But then there's the other side of the coin, suffering. What makes suffering bad? Is it just the intensity of the pain?
It's partly the sheer intensity, but the sources we're looking at, they point out something else, this feeling of it being undeserved.
Oh, I see.
Like a hurricane wipes out a town, that's awful, obviously, but it's not like it was targeting anyone specific.
Right.
But when someone who's, kind and generous constantly gets the short end of the stick, that feels different.
It feels almost personal. It's like the universe messed up or something.
Yeah, like it got the wrong address.
So how have people throughout history tried to grapple with this whole idea of undeserved suffering?
Well, religion has a lot to say about it. There's a whole branch of theology called theodicy that tries to make sense of suffering, especially in relation to a good and all-powerful God.
Because if God is all good and all-powerful, why is there suffering at all, let alone good people suffering?
Exactly. It's a tough one to reconcile.
It is. So what are some of the explanations that religions offer?
Okay, one of the big ones is the free will defense. The idea there is that God gave humans the freedom to choose, and sometimes people choose badly, right?
Yeah.
So even if you're a good person, someone else's bad choices can cause you to suffer.
That makes sense in some cases, but what about suffering that isn't directly caused by human actions, like natural disasters or genetic diseases?
Right. For those are other explanations, like the soul-making theodicy. This one says that suffering can actually be a good thing, in a way.
A good thing? How so?
Well, the idea is that going through tough times builds character, makes you more empathetic, and maybe even brings you closer to the divine or whatever you believe in.
So it's like a spiritual workout.
Kind of, yeah, but I can see how that might be hard to accept if you're in the middle of something really terrible.
Absolutely. And what about the idea of karma?
Ah, yes, karma. That's another big one.
So are we talking past lives and all that?
Yep. The idea is that maybe you're suffering now because of something you did in a past life, even if you don't remember it.
But if you don't remember it, does that really feel fair? How can you learn from a mistake you don't even know you made?
Right? That's one of the big critiques of karma, isn't it? It sort of throws free will out the window if everything is predetermined.
It does make you wonder. So we've got free will, soul-making, karma. Are any of these explanations really satisfying?
I think it depends who you ask. Some people find comfort in those beliefs, while others struggle to square them with the reality of suffering in the world.
And it seems like that's where science steps in. Maybe not to offer comfort, but to explain things from a different angle. What does science have to say about why good people suffer?
Well, science doesn't deal in good and bad the same way that, say, religion does.
Right, it's more about observing the world, right?
Exactly. It's about cause and effect, laws of nature. And those laws, they don't care about our human ideas of fairness.
So from a scientific point of view, if a good person experiences tragedy, it's not because they're being punished.
Right. It's more about chance, being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So a hurricane, an earthquake, a disease, they just happen.
Pretty much, yeah. And that can be kind of scary to think about. The universe isn't judging us, it's just indifferent.
It is a bit unsettling. But if nature doesn't care about our morals, does that mean it's pointless to try to be good? Does it even matter?
Now, that is a big question, and one we're going to explore more in depth as we continue this deep dive. It really makes you think, doesn't it? If the universe doesn't care about good and bad, what's the point of even trying?
It's a tough one, for sure. But, before we get too nihilistic,
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that suffering isn't just about some cold, indifferent universe out there.
Oh, absolutely.
We humans, we play a part in this too, right? Our systems, our choices.
Exactly. One of the sources actually uses this phrase, structural violence.
Structural violence. Whoa, that's heavy.
Yeah, it's basically the idea that some societal structures, they just create suffering, almost by design. It doesn't matter how good a person you are if you're caught in that system.
You're going to suffer.
Yeah. Poverty, oppression, war, these things create environments where suffering is almost unavoidable for certain groups of people.
Makes you realize that even if you're making good choices, the system itself might be working against you.
Right. And that's where it gets interesting, I think, because if we can identify those systems, maybe we can change them.
So it's not just about understanding why bad things happen, but also about taking action to prevent them, to create a more just world.
Totally. And on a more individual level, the sources also talk about how our own perceptions and biases can influence how we experience suffering.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, there's this thing called the just world fallacy. Have you heard of that?
Yeah. It's like that thing where people think the world is basically fair. So if someone's suffering, they must have done something to deserve it.
Exactly. It's our brain trying to make sense of things, but it can lead to some pretty messed up conclusions.
Yeah, like blaming the victim. They must have brought it on themselves somehow.
Right. And that kind of thinking prevents us from seeing the real causes of suffering, the systemic issues that are often at play.
So it's important to be aware of that bias, both in ourselves and in others.
Definitely, because if we're going to address suffering, we need to see the world clearly without those distortions.
Okay, so we've talked about the role of human systems, the role of our own perceptions. But some of the sources go even deeper than that, right? Into like spiritual and metaphysical territory.
They do, and this is where things get really mind-bending. Like, are you ready for the idea that suffering might actually be an illusion?
An illusion. Whoa, okay, you have my attention.
So there are these non-dual traditions like Advaita Vedanta and certain schools of Buddhism that say the root of suffering is actually our attachment to the ego.
Our ego, so like our sense of self.
Yeah, that feeling of being a separate individual self battling against the world. These traditions say that separation, that's the illusion.
So it's not the external events themselves that cause us to suffer, but our internal reaction to them.
Exactly. It's that resistance, that feeling of this shouldn't be happening to me that amplifies the pain.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So these traditions suggest that by letting go of that ego attachment, we can experience less suffering.
That's the idea. It's about connecting with a deeper sense of unity, of oneness with the universe. And that shift in perspective can bring a lot of peace, even in the midst of difficult circumstances.
It's about accepting what is rather than fighting against it.
Right. And one of the teachers who talks about this beautifully is Thich Nhat Hanh. He uses this term interbeing.
Interbeing, I like that.
Yeah, it captures this idea that everything is interconnected, interdependent. We're not separate individuals struggling alone.
We're all part of this big web of existence.
Exactly. And Han says that to reject suffering is to reject life itself. Because suffering is just a part of it, like joy, love, loss, it's all part of the cycle.
It's about embracing the whole messy, beautiful tapestry of life.
Exactly. And that brings us to another interesting concept from the world of mystical traditions, the dark night of the soul.
Ooh, that sounds intense. What's that all about?
So it's this term that describes a period of deep spiritual crisis. Like, you might feel intense suffering, doubt, isolation from the divine, whatever you believe in.
Doesn't sound very pleasant.
It's not. But the mystics, they see it as a necessary stage of spiritual growth.
Really?
Yeah, they say it's like a purification process, burning away old beliefs and attachments so you can emerge stronger, more connected to the divine or your true self.
Like a spiritual trial by fire.
Kind of, yeah. It's tough, but it can lead to profound transformation.
It's amazing to see how these spiritual and metaphysical perspectives offer such a different way of looking at suffering. It's not about finding someone or something to blame. It's about seeing it as a potential catalyst for growth and understanding.
Right. It's a whole different way of relating to the experience.
But let's be real. It's one thing to talk about finding meaning in suffering when you're sitting here having a calm conversation.
Yeah.
It's a whole different ballgame when you're in the thick of it.
For sure. And that's where the sources offer some more practical advice, things we can do, even if we don't fully buy into those spiritual interpretations.
Okay, so what are some of those practical takeaways? How do we move from these big ideas to concrete actions?
So when we're talking about practical advice, I think one of the biggest things that comes up in all the sources is this idea that suffering doesn't make you a bad person.
Right, like it's not some kind of scoreboard. If you're suffering, it doesn't mean you weren't good enough or something.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important point to remember because sometimes we can get caught up in this idea that if we just do all the right things, then nothing bad will ever happen to us.
It's like we're somehow immune to pain.
Yeah, but life doesn't really work that way. And the sources emphasize that instead of trying to avoid suffering altogether, which is impossible, we can focus on building resilience.
Being able to bounce back from those tough times.
Right, and finding meaning in our experiences, even the painful ones. Like, think about Viktor Frankl. He went through the horrors of the Holocaust, but he still found meaning in helping others.
Yeah, his story is incredible. It shows that even in the darkest of times, there's still a spark of human spirit that can shine through.
Absolutely. And along those lines, the sources also talk about the importance of focusing on what we can control, even when so much feels out of our hands.
So, like choosing our attitude, our response to what happened.
Exactly. We can choose to focus on gratitude, on helping others, on making the most of each day. Those choices can make a huge difference in how we experience suffering.
It's about finding that inner strength, that sense of agency, even when life throws us curveballs.
And one more thing that I think is really important to touch on, the interconnectedness of everything. The sources really emphasize that it's not just about individual responsibility, but also about recognizing that our actions have an impact on others.
That we're all part of this bigger web of life.
Exactly. And that realization can lead to more empathy, more compassion, more of a desire to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
It's about understanding that even small acts of kindness can have a ripple effect.
Right. And working towards systemic change so that suffering isn't built into the very fabric of our society.
So it's about both individual and collective action.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and compassionate world.
Wow, we've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From ancient philosophy to modern science, from spiritual practices to concrete actions we can take in our everyday lives.
It's been quite a journey. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that while suffering is an inevitable part of life, it doesn't have to define us.
We can choose how we respond to it. We can choose to find meaning, to build resilience, to connect with others, and to work towards a better world.
And ultimately, those choices, I think, are what make us truly human.
That's a beautiful thought. So to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought, some new perspectives on suffering, and maybe even a renewed sense of hope. Keep exploring these ideas, keep asking questions, and keep sharing your light with the world.
Until next time.